You know what they call a Freudian slip? When you say one thing but mean your mother? I say that because actually it was my grandmother who was the spy, so I correct that. Today I want to speak a little bit about the interesting overlap between me, my family, ethical humanism, and the social stigma of seeking professional mental health support. I'm going to weave a kind of bizarre story about my grandmother with some funny insights and a serious point. Now, as part of my training as an ethical culture leader, not only did I study counseling, but I have formally re-examined my own personal psychological influences, needs, and strengths. But while interested in psychology, the founder of ethical culture, Felix Adler, was wary of the intrusive elements of insight-oriented psychotherapy, in particular psychoanalysis. Psychiatrist and daughter of one of ethical culture's founding families, Ruth Brickner, knew of Adler's skepticism about psychoanalysis. She said Adler was, quote, opposed to the kind of scrutiny of the intimate, private life which psychiatry, especially psychoanalysis, was promulgating. She explained that he felt there was something inviolate about the core of the human spirit which should not be probed. Now, I suspect that some of Adler's perspective was reflecting his Victorian reserve, something evident in culture generally in the United States even today. Because here, I think there is a social stigma around psychological counseling, whether it's one or two times in informal sessions or years of psychoanalysis. Seeking psychological therapy is often painted as a sign of weakness in our individualistic culture, this rugged individualism, and I think that's unfortunate. I hope to counter that just a little bit by speaking out about the benefits of psychotherapy and the importance of mental health public policy in this country. And I think it's something of our social justice agenda, in fact. Now, fortunately, ethical culture has largely outgrown Adler's resistance to this and to cast off its negative view of psychotherapy, because ethical humanism encourages people to take control of their counseling. It encourages pastoral counseling, and the leadership training that I had to do to become a leader promoted attention to psychological health of members and to society at large. My own counseling training at George Washington University really helped me understand better the techniques and the limits of pastoral counseling. And it helped me place into a broader context the psychotherapy of my grandmother, my mother, and myself. Now, before delving into my family history, I want to spend a little time sharing some thoughts about effective pastoral counseling within an ethical humanist perspective, because I try to nurture values in my counseling that's common to all of my ethical culture work. I don't think there's a firm wall between it. These values include worth, balance, wholeness, meaning, relationships, and agency. Worth, balance, wholeness, meaning, relationships, and agency. Two psychotherapists whose orientation I greatly respect are Viktor Frankl and Alfred Adler, no relationship to Felix Adler. Both of them reject the bleak determinism of some Freudian approaches, and in them I find an optimistic, realistic, and ethically invigorating mix of counseling approaches that are consistent with ethical humanism. So I'm going to start with the idea of individual worth, and while it's central to Felix Adler's ethics, Adler at times seemed tortured about his own shortcomings. I don't think he had emotionally a real sense of his own worth. I think he probably could have done with some good therapy at his time. But I think that intellectually he was totally committed to the belief in worth in himself and in other people. And that marvelous human potential, the ideal that's in every one of us, is important, unique, and particular to us. Now, when counseling, I pay particular attention to the uniqueness of others. I don't believe that one approach works all. There's no one size fits all. And Felix Adler insisted that every individual has worth by virtue of the fact that they have a particular place in the greater whole. Viktor Frankl echoes this respect for uniqueness He believes that none of us, you or me, can be replaced. No one can live our lives for us. Each of us has a unique place in the world that's sacred, if you wish. This counseling orientation, I think, acknowledges one's own self-worth as the basis of wellness. And I think a wellness approach to mental health is something that we're beginning to see more of in our society. A second value is balance, particularly between the heart and the head. Now, humanism has for a long time been very engaged in intellectual rigor and rationalism. I don't think we've done as well integrating emotions into our philosophy. I think we're doing better now. But certainly, we have to integrate emotions in order to maximize our freedom. It's not a purely rational thing. Counseling within this context has to get beyond the mistake that some scientific approaches to humanism takes. So I hope that my counseling honors both the emotions and the intellect's ability to affect emotions. So related to this sense of self-worth and this emotional, rational balance, is a third value, and that's a psychological wholeness. In the reconstruction of the spiritual ideal, Felix Adler talks about the intolerable strain of the divided conscience. He describes the divided conscience as split between the public and the private. But the quest for wholeness can have to overcome a whole series of different divisions. He writes that this quest is felt by people, quote, who are eagerly desirous to make their life whole, all of a piece, of achieving consistency in their conduct throughout. I wonder how many of you here today want that sense of wholeness. I do, I know. So in my experience, whether it's as a counselor or as a counselee, for me the biggest challenge to wholeness is integrating the good and the bad within each of us. How can we admit this mixed bag? In other words, care for ourselves, love ourselves, while at the same time trying to grow and change. So I like the approach, you've heard me talk about it before, of Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh. He wrote one essay that I like particularly called Transforming Our Compost. Transforming Our Compost. He urges us to accept the good and the bad, the garbage that he says is part of our lives. Because denial of the garbage only allows it to pile up in our lives through the suffering, the shame, the fear, or the anger. So I try to integrate the bad in myself as part of this process of growth. And Thich Nhat Hanh says we should accept all of ourselves as a whole, compassionately. And in that way we can transform the garbage into compost so that we can plant it in our garden and from it flowers can bloom. C.G. Jung, the great psychoanalyst, said, wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. Another aspect of wholeness that I think is important is viewing life in its totality over time. Fundamental to Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, fairly popular over the last 30, 40 years in this country. He asks you to look at your life as a whole, like a book, up till the last sentence and the last period, that is death. And then he says, imagine that you've lived your life through all the up and downs, the trials and tribulations, and then you're given the chance to come back to this moment and live it over again. Not changing how you live, but changing your attitude towards it. How would you live then? He says he hopes we would live it more freely. But living it freely doesn't mean changing the hand you've been dealt. It means changing your attitude towards it. And it reminds me in some ways of the words that I heard my mother often say, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. The fourth value in therapy that I embrace is the construction of meaning. And I stress the word construction as much as the term meaning there, because I think in a lot of ways, Alfred Adler, for example, influenced my thinking here, that I think that what's most important is not what has happened to you in your past, but how you interpret it so you can move into the future with energy and enthusiasm. Cliched Freudian approaches to psychotherapy often look at memories like like an archaeologist digging in the soil and finding pieces of pottery, statically preserved for all time. But Alfred Adler emphasizes that memory is active and creative, and that we are evolving subjects engaged in the construction of our experience and our meaning. And that gives us tremendous power. Now, I think that there are some contemporary approaches to psychotherapy that emphasize contentment and happiness, and they diverge from Alfred Adler and Freud's stressing contentment, stressing meaning instead. I often think to myself, would I rather live a life that was happy but not meaningful, or a life that was meaningful but not happy? Now, I think a lot of times these sorts of hypotheticals are deceptive. But I'd like to think that I'd choose meaning. Besides, I'm not quite sure how a life could be happy if it felt meaningless either. But more to the point, in my counseling approach, I believe that happiness arises more often not when you're trying to get it itself, but aiming at something else, like meaning or connection. And a fifth goal of my counseling work is to nurture healthy ethical relationships, including a flourishing and collaborative relationship between therapist and client. Bringing out the best in each other is the core to ethical humanism. Within that counseling, like within life, I assume that interpersonal work is mutually empowering, full of mutual respect and openness and caring. And this sense of equality is wrapped up the importance of everybody feeling safe, counselor and counselee, within clear, healthy interpersonal boundaries. Because it's often the lack of clear boundaries that get us into therapy to begin with. So I think in pastoral counseling, helping people distinguish healthy interpersonal boundaries from overly dependent attachment on others, including the counselor. And the sixth value that I mentioned, ethical agency. The capacity to make choices, take actions, and accept responsibility. With ethical humanism, agency is often portrayed as our effort to move from the real to the ideal. I mean, the real world exists, independent of our hopes and desires, but we're blessed and burdened with an imagination that can think of a world that is different. When we contemplate a reality that's different from this world, when we contemplate a future or an ideal, we can then choose to try to build that. For many, there's a great therapeutic value in struggling to transform the world we live in from the real to the ideal. And this struggle provides a forum where we can all meet to work together to try to transform this world. And this cooperative effort connects us to something greater than ourselves. One of the most important parts of living a fulfilling life. Viktor Frankl says, "Thus it can be seen that mental health is based on a certain degree of tension. The tension between what one has already achieved and what one still ought to accomplish. The gap between what one is and what one should become." And that's a healthy tension. In this process of flourishing rather than the experience of happiness, that for me comes to the closest of what Aristotle meant by the Greek term eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. Often this term, I think, is mistranscribed as meaning happiness, like some sort of state of consciousness. But it's really meant by Aristotle as a state of productive being, of an activity. And within my mind, that's a better goal of therapy, because within a flourishing life, you're going to find sense of worth and balance and wholeness and relationship and agency. It's that flourishing that's the most important. So, there's a lot there. When I offer pastoral counseling, from my perspective as somebody who has benefited from psychotherapy, I appreciate most of this through stories. I think psychotherapy is about telling your story. So in standing up at this lectern for the rest of this talk, maybe I am metaphorically lying down on the couch. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to engage in inappropriately indulgent, overly personal, cathartic Self-disclosure. Some of you may be disappointed by that. But I've done enough therapeutic work in my life that I don't need to bare my soul publicly. Besides, the need for attention that I might have pales in comparison with that same need in my grandmother, who's the real star of this story. She gave me my middle name. She gave me my love of cats. She gave me an interest in psychology. And she gave me a great story that I will share with you now about my grandmother, the spy. Mary Bancroft, who I called Baba, was a charming, intelligent, engaged woman, which if she were alive today, she'd surely tell you. This is very different from my father's side of the family, who thought that it's bad form to talk about yourself or your ancestors. But for my grandmother, it was a mission. It was a vocation to talk about herself. So in giving myself permission to tell you about my grandmother, I'm sort of channeling that side of the family. But I hope that it gives you a little better idea of how I navigate the crossroads of ethical culture and psychology. In her memoirs, immodestly entitled Autobiography of a Spy, debutante writer, confidant, secret agent, the true story of her extraordinary life, she shares some juicy tidbits about her life that sort of color in the bizarre stories I heard during family meals growing up. The New York Times wrote, "If Mary Bancroft had not existed, a hack novelist would surely have invented her or tried." She managed to overcome her setbacks to become known as, quote, a Boston Brahmin Colleen who cut a coquettish swath through 20th century history, bewitching men of power. Now, she was driven by a traumatic childhood that unleashed psychological forces within her, so I got to go back to the beginning on that. She was born, Mary Bancroft, the only child of Hugh and Mary Agnes Cogan Bancroft, on October 29, 1903, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Hours later, her Catholic mother died of complications. The newborn Mary was surreptitiously placed in a laundry basket and whisked away by her Protestant grandparents to their home so she would not be raised Catholic. So she never developed a close relationship with her father or his second wife, who was described as a, quote, disapproving, if not wicked, stepmother. She grew into a daring, restless woman who found Smith College such a bore that she would escape after a year into what turned out to be a stultifying marriage. In 1923, she married U.S. state champion Sherwin Badger, only to find herself trapped in the role of a young married woman. As she wrote in her autobiography, she said, "I got pregnant almost at once and hated every minute of it." After a happy respite after the baby arrived, however, a skin disease took the infant's life. In 1928, Baba birthed my uncle, and in 1930, my mother was born. She soon got divorced, and in 1933, after her father, my great-grandfather, committed suicide by concocting a poisonous gas that killed him instantly, Baba fell into another listless marriage with a Swiss businessman. And despite the disappointment in that relationship, she left her young son with his father and took my mother across the Atlantic to Switzerland and dove into expatriate social life. Bored and dissatisfied, she turned to psychology for both intellectual engagement and personal health. Her specific goal was to try to help her cure herself with a curious problem: violent sneezing attacks that struck her at social functions. Now, she had test after test to identify allergies, and they turned up nothing. So instead, she sought support from C.G. Jung and his psychological club seminars in Zurich, and she became an active part of Zurich's Jungian circle. After a year and a half of analysis with Tony Wolfe, who was Jung's assistant, Wolfe said that Mary Bancroft was, quote, as curious as a monkey. Maybe some family connections there. After that, Jung took her on as a patient for 4 years. My grandmother and Jung analyzed her dreams and discussed world affairs, in particular the collective unconscious that the German people were seeing come out of Germany as Nazism, and she described it as a coming back of the Scandinavian war god Wotan. She discussed with Jung many things, and this bonded them together, much more than her sneezing fits did, which Jung offered a almost obvious explanation. You see, Baba liked being the center of attention. At social events, however, when she was competing with other high society types for attention, she would begin to get terribly restless. And so, conveniently, when she started sneezing uncontrollably, everybody would start paying attention to her. They'd offer her water or her handkerchief or something. And so everything was fine, the sneezing would stop, but then predictably, the spotlight would then go back away from her, and people would start talking about something other than Mary Bancroft, and she'd start sneezing again. And so she said, "What should I do?" And Jung said, "Don't go to parties." He counseled her to instead hold small soirees at her own home where she could sit at the head of the table, direct the conversation, and remain the queen bee. Well, Baba was very happy to tell many of the people that she was one of Jung's patients, and she apparently intrigued Jung as well. He described her as an extroverted intuitive who, quote, experienced such inter-family battles for her affections as a child that power had become her natural element. Now, Baba seized on this idea of power, appreciating a new paradigm in her life that came from Jung. For her, the opposite of love was not hate, but power. So to compensate for a sense of a lack of love, she sought out power to create that balance. And this quest for power contributed to one of her most notorious traits, narcissism. And you know the myth of Narcissus, who stares into the pond of water, and he's so handsome and he falls in love with himself that he can't pull himself away from his own reflection. Well, as a narcissist, my grandmother could sometimes be fascinating and at other times totally insufferable. After she died, I found in her papers a 1967 Jungian journal entitled Narcissism, a Journal of Archetype and Culture, and it featured, predictably, my grandmother. Well, from Baba's perspective, Jung's explanation of her sneezing attacks was too simple. It wasn't exotic enough for her. So, as Jung predicted, Baba stormed out of analysis, calling Jung all sorts of names that he thought was very amusing. She spent months writing him letters telling him, this is her words, basically what a son of a bitch I thought he was. And Jung found that a, quote, most disagreeable experience. And as Jung predicted as well, she soon came back to analysis and spent another couple of years. Once that she realized he was not going to be the replacement father that she wanted, analysis ended. They did remain good friends. She freely offered her own insights into Jung's psyche, and they discussed the conquest of social life that my grandmother continued on. He helped her negotiate the complex period of her life when the madness of World War II descended across Europe. And this is where the story gets really interesting. Baba became a spy for the Overseas Secret Service. She had great language skills and analytical skills, as well as a strong intuition, and she served as an intelligence agent from 1941 to 1944 for Allen Dulles, who was head of the OSS. Now, Dulles coordinated America's investigation of Nazi war plans and culture and politics and technology. This was not enough for my grandmother, so she decided to have an affair with Allen Dulles. Now, Dulles was clear that he was not going to get divorced from his wife, so a double deception began to arise. It should work out very well, Dulles said. We can let the work cover the romance, and the romance cover the work. In other words, having two secrets was better than none because you could use one to hide the other from the other. So the personal people thought they couldn't talk about their relationship because of espionage, and the people involved in espionage thought that we're not talking about things because of their affair. Worked out very well. Baba helped him from his home in Bern, Switzerland, with his nightly calls back to Washington, after which they would engage in what my grandmother called a bit of dalliance. This affair continued on a torrid pace with almost daily meetings as more intelligence gathering arose. She played the part of a writer who was taking notes from a German officer named Hans Gustavius, claiming to be typing up his memoirs. That was the cover. But in reality, Gustavius was giving her war secrets that she was typing up and handing to Allen Dulles. Now, they included the plans for the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt that was part of that Tom Cruise movie, which was bungled, and almost every officer was caught except for Gustavius. Many of the secrets that my grandmother typed up were done in my mother's bedroom because they correctly figured out that that would be the last room, a child's bedroom, that the Nazis would consider planting a listening device. So without time to go too much more into my grandmother's story, you can read it here. Suffice it to say that Gustavius did survive the war. My grandmother did do more intelligence work, and then eventually she returned back to the United States more content and calm than when she left, and spent her remaining 40 years in New York volunteering for politics and courting New York socialites. So, from a counseling perspective, how did Mary Bancroft do regarding worth, balance, wholeness, meaning, relationship, and agency? Well, for the first half of her life, clearly, I doubt she had a strong sense of self-worth. She lost her mother at birth. She was rejected by her mean stepmother. She was abandoned by a suicidal father. She lost her first baby after a couple of weeks. She was divorced twice. Her own worth was certainly something that was questioned in her mind. And despite her powerful personality, she desperately sought approval and acceptance, especially from powerful people and especially from powerful men. Second, she certainly fought for a greater sense of wholeness much of her life. She was pressured to play certain social roles as a debutante or as a wife, and her consciousness, she said, was split. And now there are many divisions in her life, and certainly she was cut off from her place of birth due to World War II. They couldn't go back. She was also, I think, as a spy, you have to compartmentalize your life, and you play up those divisions. But eventually, she did get a sense of wholeness through a story that had a great deal of meaning to her. She found coherence through her analysis and through writing, and what was once a broken life, by the time I knew her as an adult, was really a unified story. Achieving a balance between head and heart was definitely difficult for her. I mean, she had turbulent inner emotions and a great rational mind. So she applied her mind to analyzing her emotions, but it wasn't well into maturity that she found a sense of calm balance between these two. And while I think she definitely had agency, I wouldn't describe it as ethical agency. I think this is where she could not go further. Her relationships, for example, were not mutual relationships based on mutual respect, but really came out of her own needs. She felt the world didn't appreciate her, so she was going to make those relationships appreciate her. And so power over her relationships were her main form of communication. Now, she applied many of those to her espionage work. The obituary in the New York Times said that she was a woman with penetrating intelligence, infallible intuition, boundless verve, not to mention legs that rarely failed to draw a second glance. But as a young woman, when she used her intelligence and her verve and her legs, she did so not out of respect for the other person, but as a way to survive, as a way to psychically survive. Many of her relationships were about using others, about deceiving others, and they were really real only in name as a relationship. Often they were just about her. So, what's the connection with pastoral counseling and the work that I try to do? Well, psychological issues have a tendency to be handed down from one generation to the next. And certainly my mother did not escape the ravages of my grandmother's psyche. My mother felt unprotected and totally at sea in an unpredictable world. She was separated from her father and the brother that she loved at a very early age, brought to Europe as a toddler. She felt like a footnote to her mother's espionage and sexual exploits and social climbing. Add all to that, imagine the hushed tones that accompanied the German officer when she arrived at my grandmother's apartment and was taken to my mother's bedroom, where my mother was told to leave, and she'd have to leave her mother behind a closed door in her bedroom with a German officer. I would think that would take years to sort out in therapy. What a bizarre moment. All of this did take its toll on my mother, who died a few years ago. For much of her life, she was filled with doubts and anxiety that led to therapy. And despite the fact that the doctor prescribed her into addiction, she still managed to live a rich life. She had an indomitable spirit and creativity, and her life really turned out more comic than tragic. While Baba dedicated her autobiography to my mother dedicated herself to overcoming a powerful, dominating mother while keeping a sense of humor. And therapy did help her with that. She did remarkably well. She even laughed about the time when she was in her 20s and she found a book on Jungian archetypes in her mother's apartment and opened it up. And there was a picture that my mother drew at 6 years old. And it was a picture of her mother, Baba, portrayed as a human goat devil with horns, crawling out of a dark world into a sunlit world to eat all the pretty flowers with its sharp, pointy teeth. And my grandmother couldn't figure out why my mother wasn't pleased that she had her artwork published as some sort of psychic representation of psychic scars. But in the tradition of my family's narcissism, I'll now turn the spotlight back to me. It was partially due to my mother's struggles that my brother and I got into a lot of fights as kids. With a psychologically confused mother and a distant academic father, who I loved dearly, both, my brother and I would get at each other big time. It would usually start the same way. John would stick his tongue out at me, and I'd start whining and squirming, and my mother would start yelling, saying, "I don't care, I don't care." And finally she said, "You guys want to fight? Fight." And it didn't take the 8-year-old brother to bloody the nose of the 6-year-old gnat that seemed to annoy him so much. And at the end of all of these fights, I'd always feel like it was my fault. So these things were being handed down. As the family story goes, it was at that time, about 6 years old, I started to have regular violent nightmares. And my sleep-deprived father would say, "Can't you take him to see somebody?" So my mother did. She took me to a very nice gentleman, Mr. Seymour Lussman, and he was great. He was friendly, he cared about me, this was our time, he had a big bucket of magic markers and a roll of paper that he would unfurl every time we would meet. And he and I would draw these murals, and they always had the same theme. It was always me attacking my brother. I remember one very well where I drew an underground bunker and John was in there on a shortwave radio saying, "SOS, SOS, help, help." And all these tanks were coming at it, and I was in a plane that was dive bombing on this thing with missiles, right? Well, Dr. Lussman and I agreed that we wouldn't tell John. They would only hurt his feelings. But every time we would roll up the paper, we'd put a rubber band on them, I'd bring them home, and we'd put them in my parents' closet for safekeeping. Well, eventually the nightmares stopped. Now, I didn't engage in psychological counseling for many years after that, but when I did, I went for it big time. I engaged in 4 years of intensive psychoanalysis, and I'm not going to indulge you with my personal demons, we all have them. But I will say that I'm proud of the work that I did in that psychotherapy. I saw it as sort of a master's degree in self-knowledge. It calmed me, it centered me, it helped me accept my own flaws and limitations, and it offered me a sense of worth and balance, wholeness. It helped me nurture ethical agency and meaning, and it really helped the ethical relations in my life flourish. When I speak to other people about psychoanalysis, they're often surprised. They say, "You seem so normal." Their innocent comment, though, prompts in me this question: what is normal? When is that used? Well, it's usually used to apply to other people against their will when they're called abnormal. So I try to not use that term. But if what people meant was that I seemed calm and confident and comfortable with myself, caring towards others, then yes, I do think that therapy helped me nurture those qualities. But the work goes on. More to the point, their reaction, I think, reveals the negative association we still have with therapy in this country. It infects American culture. Mental health is treated so differently than physical health. We'll talk till the end of days about our various physical ailments, but mention having to see a counselor or anxieties, and people begin to back away from each other. Mental health is often kept in the closet. So, to a degree, I step out of the closet today because psychotherapy did a hell of a lot of good for me. It helped me become an ethical culture leader. Simply acknowledging what narcissism was handed down in our family helps me at least avoid the more destructive aspects of that self-centeredness. I appreciate better the common human failings and foibles that we all confront, every one of us. I found it tremendously liberating, and it guides me in my counseling work. So, I encourage others to throw away the shame that often blocks engagement in counseling. Within ethical culture, where mutuality and interdependence are regarded as fundamental to our growth, as individuals seeking counseling is not about admission of failure or confession to a superior. We don't have guilt-filled confessional booths in ethical humanism, thank goodness. We don't believe in that. When I offer myself to a member for some pastoral counseling, I do so as a partner in life's most rewarding experience, sharing the experience of living together. In an expression that I got from Jung, we are all in this soup together. As an expression of social justice, we should not be afraid to express the importance of seeking counseling for ourselves, for our loved ones, or for everybody in this society as part of universal health care. Thank you for listening.